It's a privilege to introduce this book, Child Development from Birth to Age 5, A Guide for Practitioners. The idea of this book was born after a course for practitioners on child development in Dehradun. Our aim was to write a book on child development in the Indian context in Hindi and English. And I'm really glad that this book is now published by Latika Roy Foundation, an NGO in Dehradun, India. I'm going to introduce you to some of the main themes in this book. The first theme to understand is that the child's potential is not fixed or static, and the child is not the only one responsible for building this potential. This potential can be increased or decreased by the environment and people around the child, and the child's stimulation, health, and nourishment. By the time of the birth, hundreds of billions of neurons have been formed and have arrived at the right place in the brain. And that tells you something. That pregnancy, the care of the mother in pregnancy, is one of the most important things one can do to build the child's potential. The rest of the story is about connectivity. The connectivity determines the intelligence. Yes, the genes provide a template and the nourishment builds the brain, but the experience shapes it. Connections are formed and strengthened by experience, and the experience is most effective in the first few years of life. If the child gets the experience, the connections are formed. If the child doesn't get the experience, the connections disappear or are weakened. These connections continue to be formed and strengthened throughout the life, more or less. And that's the basis of our ongoing learning in life. But the most important period for the child development are the first few years of their lives. Quite often, the focus of the assessment is too narrow on measuring development or identifying impairments. A lot can be done by exploring the risk factors that impede development and protective and promoting factors for development. Every child has some risk factors and some protective factors. But what we know now is the higher the number of these risk factors, the greater the risk to the child's health and development. And there is a long-term impact of these risk factors on the health of people. And we know that cardiovascular health of adults depends on early impact or the toxic stress created by these risk factors. Now, you may not be able to eliminate all these risk factors, but reduce some or reduce the impact of some of them and enhance the promoting and protective factors. Tip the balance in favor of the child. The next theme is that the domains of development are interconnected and development is variable. It is useful to describe the domains of development. They are helpful for description. They're also helpful for asking help from specialists. But if there is any weakness in one of these domains, there is almost always an impact on the other aspect of the development. And that's worth understanding, the interconnectedness or the interdependence of these domains. A milestone is simply when about half the children achieve certain ability. Now, that doesn't mean the other half before it and the other half after it are abnormal. And one doesn't have to take a cuckoo clock approach in deciding, oh, well, the child isn't achieving the milestone, so there's got to be something wrong with it. Impairments are identifying by looking at risk factors, by looking at red flags, by looking at qualitative differences in the way children do things, and by looking at certain patterns of development. One of the questions for a practitioner is how to identify an impairment. Now, one thing that helps in that are looking at the sequences and patterns of development, knowing about certain unusual patterns of development. One of those is the deviation from the norm. Now, what that means is that there is a pattern to development. Say, for example, children mostly sit before they stand. Children mostly understand language before they speak. But there are some children who maybe because they have some spasticity in their legs, they find it relatively easier to actually stand than to sit. And there are children who speak words, combinations, phrases, but they don't understand the meaning of those words. And that indicates that there may be an impairment here. The next pattern worth knowing about is the dissociation pattern. Now, most of the domains of development generally progress together, a little bit here, a little bit there, but they're generally in the same direction. Now, if one comes across a pattern of development where one domain is significantly behind the other, then the interconnectedness is broken and there is a dissociation of development, and that is an indicator of a likely impairment. The next pattern I want to highlight is the plateauing or regression of development. Children who have progressed typically up to a certain point, but then either they stop advancing at all in one or more domains, or they go back, they lose certain skills that they had previously, and that's called regression. Now, we see this pattern in about a third of children with autism, and we also see it in certain rare neurological conditions and certain degenerative disorder. So if you come across the pattern of regression, then it's almost considered to be a neurological emergency, and it's worth seeking an urgent advice from a pediatrician or a neurologist. Listening to parents, asking their concerns, and communicating with them is a major theme throughout this book. Parents are often quite anxious and nervous and hesitant, so they often don't even bring out all the concerns and all the information. And it's not just about asking, it's about eliciting those concerns. So you have to know what to ask. And specific questions about each domain at different ages are provided in this book. But then you have to know how to ask. You start asking using how questions. How does he communicate with you? You don't ask questions in a way that gives you the answer that you want, like, you're not worried about your child's hearing, are you? That's not the right way of asking questions. And then you also focus on some basic principles of communication. You give time. You're not rushed when you're talking to parents. You be attentive. You pay attention to what they're saying. You remain polite with parents. You don't interrupt them and interfere. You confirm your understanding. You don't make assumptions. You check your understanding with them. And these are the basic principles of communication that you stick to. Of the many themes described in this book, I want to emphasize the one on communication and play. Because in these days of emphasis on structured learning, these two are often ignored, while they are like oxygen for the developing brain. Interestingly, even without any sound, there is a lot you can see in this picture about communication. Communication is about capturing attention. It's about creating interest. It's about motivating, listening, and responding, and following and leading with sounds, with gestures, with expressions. Communication and play is the basis of our socializing, learning, and achieving independence. Throughout the book, ideas are given about how to promote children's communication abilities. Children communicate best when they're interested and motivated, and you can help parents pick up those skills and create opportunities, and you can help provide resources like toys, pictures, and books to help their child communicate better. They're simple ideas: minimizing background noise, responding to their children's actions and movements as if they understand what they're trying to say, communicating using a variety of ways, not just words, using expressions, eye contact, body language, simplifying the speech, using one or two words or simple sentences, and communicating with children in day-to-day activities, responding to their sounds and whatever they're saying, and not correcting their errors, modeling the right ways of talking, asking what and how questions to encourage them. Now you could ask, do parents really need help in playing with their child? Well, I'll tell you two things about it. The first is that playing is one of the most crucial components of sensitive, responsive parenting. It's one of the most useful things parents can do to promote their child's development. I often ask parents, how do you play with your child, or how does the child play? They look left, they look right, and they say, well, he plays. I say, how? Plays with toys. What else do you want to know? There is some very useful information given in this book about using day-to-day activities and day-to-day household objects. You don't need complicated large toys to play with the child. You just need to know how to create interest, how to motivate the child, how to participate, engage with the child, and how to maintain the child's interest, how to communicate with the child while you're playing. And if you can convey that to a parent, if you can enable a parent in playing well with the child, you would have done one of the most useful things you could do for promoting that child's development. Vision and hearing are our main learning modalities. And if any impairment of these gets missed, then we either make the wrong conclusion about the child's development, or we miss out in giving the right intervention at the right time to the child, causing long-term consequences for the child. Now, this book starts with giving some risk factors. If there is a significant risk factor present, say, for example, the child has a ear, head, or face abnormality, then you're well advised to take some specialist opinion from the eye clinic or from the audiologist rather than rely on your observations of the child's hearing behavior. It is made clear in this book that what we are observing in the child are visual behaviors or hearing behaviors. We are not testing hearing or vision in the clinic. First of all, it gives a simple checklist of a pattern of development of visual behavior or hearing behavior. And you can use these checklists to elicit parents' concern and to work out whether the child's visual behavior or hearing behavior is developing appropriately. And if there is a concern, you seek specialist opinion. The book also describes ways of observing these behaviors and warns that it's very easy to make unreliable observation. If you make a little noise when you are checking a child's vision, or if you give some visual clues when you're checking a child's hearing, then your observation is not going to be reliable. It's better to work on identifying risk factors and parental concerns using the checklists that are provided for seeking specialist opinion. The book describes the areas of a physical examination that are essential part of any assessment. It makes the point that measuring of height, weight, head circumference is absolutely imperative when you are examining a child who has got developmental vulnerability. Because stunting, which is closely linked with developmental difficulties, could be caused by thyroid deficiency, malnutrition, or iron deficiency anemia. Now, all these are treatable, and you could be preventing long-term disability here by acting on your concerns. It describes systemic examination and advises to seek specialist help if there is any concern. It also describes examining children for looking for any sign of physical abuse. You identify it early and create the protective environment around the child. Now, assessing development is a complex business, and there is absolutely no point doing it without a scheme that you have practiced and you are familiar with. A scheme is described in this book, and one element of that scheme is a simple three-step process of asking, observing, and analyzing. It describes three types of asking: asking for their concerns, asking for current abilities, and asking for risk factors. It uses certain symbols to help practitioners: the symbol of an eye to observe, the ear to listen and ask, and a combination, and the symbol of red flags, which are indicators of certain abilities which are significantly delayed or which are qualitatively different. And with this scheme, it takes the practitioner forward to the next step. Children's current abilities and ways of observing them are described on the same page for certain key ages. Now, it's not as if children are only assessed on those key ages, but once you have practiced the scheme in that way, then you could adjust it accordingly. The scheme for observing is described for three broad groups of children: the infants under the age of 12 months, the toddler age group, and the preschool age group. So that makes it easy for practitioners to adjust it in their practice. Earlier, we talked about the skill of communicating with parents, but there's another skill that practitioners should have, and which is the skill of engaging children. Now, children come into the clinics or into the assessment areas, which are new areas, new people, strange people. They're anxious, they're worried. And then often practitioners may have the attitude of kind of being doctor-like or teacher-like. And it's very unlikely that you're really going to see what the child can do and have a correct idea about what the child's ability is. Engaging children requires an an approach which is gentle and reassuring with a smile, and it makes it like fun. I mean, we're going to do something, creating a kind of interest with the child, praising a child, motivating them, encouraging them. Oh, I'm sure you can do this one. More like that. And joining in activities like an older friend, not like a teacher. Being interested in what they're doing, giving it a little bit of time, letting it settle, but not being over friendly and not being too loud, because that might scare some of them. The next theme emphasized in this book is having a system for making sense of your findings, all the information that you've gathered so far. Now, you need to answer three basic questions. You need to work out, is there a problem? And does it matter? If it does matter, then what are you going to do about it? Now, the scheme is described in 4 steps. The first step is understanding the impact of risk factors on children's development. The second is working out the significance of any delay in development or in the difference in pattern of development that you might have identified, and then combining this information to decide the next step, and then using an algorithm. And the algorithms differ for those children who may have a global development affecting all their domains significantly, or their developmental impairment may be just in one area, like in language development or motor development. So these algorithms are described as a guidance for practitioners to decide about their next step. Practitioners ought to have a clear view about what to do in different situations. In some situations, they may simply want to give some proactive advice about nutrition, stimulation, care to promote the child's development. In other situations, they might explore the causes of the impairment that they have identified, and they could do that with the algorithm provided in the book. Algorithms are only guides. They provide a structure so that you don't miss out on all the information that you've gathered from asking parents, observing, and investigations. But they're not really a replacement for a trained, experienced clinician. So keep that in mind. Always seek advice if you are ever in doubt about these situations. The final theme of the book is about being a good practitioner. Your purpose is of helping the child and the family and not becoming a burden or stress to them. So gather information, work like a team, and help them. Remember, every assessment is also an intervention. The parents and the child are watching you. They're learning from you. You are a co-creator of the child's potential. First, do no harm. Know your limitations. Don't falsely reassure parents. Always remember, helping parents doesn't have to wait till the assessment is finished. But you can start helping parents, giving them ideas about improving the care of the child, improving the child's diet and nourishment. You can inform parents, enable parents about ways of stimulating the child, improving their health, or supporting parents psychologically, socially, and if possible, financially. Communicate with parents with empathy. Now, empathy doesn't mean sugarcoating the information you give to parents, but it does mean listening to them. It means supporting them. It means empathizing with their difficulties. Now, some do's and don'ts of good practice worth remembering. Don't make premature judgments about the presence or absence of an impairment, because you might be putting the child on the wrong track for life. As I said earlier, don't give false assurance. Be honest, but at the same time, be supportive. Discuss the next step with parents carefully and acknowledge that all children, all parents have strengths. Encourage them and enable them to use those to move forward. Being a good practitioner implies that you have a toolkit. You have a toolkit of skills and competencies. At the same time, you have a toolkit of resources. And those resources could be information that you can give to parents. And there is plenty of information provided in this book about promoting children's development in different areas. And you could photocopy them and give it to parents. But you could also gather other local information for supporting parents. Connect them locally. Encourage them. Support them. You are helping the child. You're building the child's potential. Thank you for listening to me.